How you doing? So once again, we're back to another edition of Unorthodox Politics. But this one's going to be kind of a little different. We're going to talk about religion. So let's talk about Christianity. So first thing you have to remember is that Christianity is an Eastern religion. And so a Russian Orthodox Christian has almost nothing in common with a Texas evangelical. So what's going on here? Well, the answer is if you are a Christian and you have read a Bible in English, you're looking at hearsay because Jesus spoke Aramaic, so you pretty much have to look at Aramaic or Hebrew and then maybe Greek in the original language to get any context about what you believe God's words were. So by the time it gets to English, you're looking at, especially in the West, especially because it went to the West in America and in Europe through the King, and some for the most part, if you're reading King James. And not only are you lacking context, because anytime a language is translated, you lose some context. You're also at the mercy of people who are biased, because King James was obviously biased. And so, or at least had his own agenda. But it gets even, and it's not the only king involved, but it gets even worse if you are someone who only speaks English or who only reads English. Because overall, also the customs are different as well. The Ethiopians pray differently than people in Texas or in Idaho. Everything has changed going from east to west. Why is that? In part because you're dealing with stories. And this is both a good thing and a bad thing. If you look at Christianity as a way to teach children morality, it works. And that's why actually it's been so successful. In other words, it's a religion, if you look at the opponents of Christianity, it's a religion designed for children. But that's not a bad thing. A lot of things, if you look at Pixar makes movies for children. But guess what? They're also some of the best movies for adults. So I'm not saying any of this to knock Christians or Christianity. I'm trying to tell you where all this comes from. And also why there's so much division within not only the United States, but also the rest of the world. Because as this religion moved west, everything changed. The people east of Switzerland, for the most part, if they call themselves Christian, they celebrate Christmas in January, not in December. So, in fact, December 25th is actually a birthday of a sun god called Mithra, Mithra. So you've got a lot of stories going back and forth, and this is, again, not a knock, because you can't teach a child the law. You can't tell a 7-year-old, if you're trying to teach a 7-year-old something, hey, let's look up fee simple defeasibles, let's look up, subsection 4. And any ideology, for the most part, has to be attractive to children. Because by the time you become an adult, it's almost too late. You're going to learn more facts as you get older, but your moral core, for the most part, is already formed by the time you're 13, 14, 15, 16, and so on and so forth, for the most part. So again, when you look at all of these things going back and forth, if you are in the West, the key thing to remember, if you're Christian and you only speak English, is that everything you believe in is hearsay. But that's not a bad thing, because it gives you the freedom to make up your own stories. In other words, if you're not tied down to the law, you have more freedom, right? So this is actually one of the reasons why, again, good thing and a bad thing. Jewish people under Muslim rule, both of these religions are law and order for the most part. And the Muslims became less strict because they learned from Christianity. They became less strict, and so it worked very well. Jews were protected for, any time they were under Muslim rule, Jews were protected all the way up until World War I. So, you can go back to, go to the museum in the Prado Museum, Museo del Prado in Madrid, and just take a look. There are so many paintings there, including the one where a Jewish leader is offering the Catholic representative of the king lots of treasures and gold in order to stay in what is now becoming Catholic Spain. And in the oil painting, I think it's an oil painting, they just basically, you've got the representative throwing pieces of gold to the floor in the direction of the kneeling Jewish representative. And so ultimately, again, to give you an idea of how powerful stories are, in 1492, that's not when Columbus sailed the ocean blue. We talk about stories. So remember, we have a national holiday in the United States about a man, Columbus, who's not even born with the name Columbus. We gave that name to him. He's Italian, right? He never stepped foot in the United States. So we have a national holiday about a guy who's with a fake name, basically, who never stepped foot in the United States. And people get a day off because of this. So what happened in 1492, what really happened, and it shows you how far the establishment will go to cover these things up. They'll make a holiday about a guy who basically has no connection with the United States. In 1492, Catholic Spain expelled the Jewish community from Spain. They had to go south. I think about 10 years later, the Muslims were expelled. So they had to go south to Toledo, and then farther south, eventually, to northern Africa. And that's part of the history of that world, basically. But remember, almost every American student is taught in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. They're taught that to cover up what actually happened in 1492. So, if you are in a country that's willing to go to that far to deceive you, what else are they lying to you about? And what are they complaining about when people talk about a lot of other issues, about inclusion and so on and so forth? We have a national holiday about a guy who's not even named Columbus, who never stepped foot in the United States. Okay, we talk about that. So, talking about stories. Now, let's talk about right away, right? You can see that the absence of strict laws helps creativity. But the problem is that you still have to have a good education. If you don't, the absence of laws allows stories to be targeted towards enemies effectively. And so, I could be wrong about this, but there was no Christian empire that peaked for more than 150 years. They lasted longer than 150 years, but for the most part, they weren't necessarily places you wanted to live in, except for that brief 150 years. And typically what happens is that there's a pogrom, there's a massacre that goes on, usually against minorities that don't buy into this story or these stories, and have to be expelled effectively in order for the establishment to maintain its authority and its credibility. So, you've got to put all this stuff together and just imagine how much money is spent teaching you the wrong things. But again, why does it work? We talked about that. So if you're Muslim, one of the key ingredients to your belief system is chain of custody. So the chain of custody of the Quran is absolute. Nobody is going to tell you what I just told you about the Bible in English, that it's changed and so on and so forth. But guess what? That limits you. So suddenly, if you start telling stories, ultimately what ends up happening is you start to affect and perhaps diminish that core principle of Islam, which is that we've got this unbroken chain of custody. Let's keep it, let's not pollute it with all these stories that we're making up. So you got that issue. And again, that is limiting. And that also explains, by the way, overall, people without morality have been more financially successful because they haven't followed the law. And so you have to, as you get older, start to see through all the different things that you consider to be successful or measures of success. And that's when you start to get an education, is when you start to see places that you consider to be poor, not necessarily poor, just places that haven't been, I don't want to use the word colonized, but haven't been impacted by outside forces that only care about money. and not about the culture or preserving the culture. So let's get back to what we just talked about. So the Jews under Muslims, perfectly fine up until World War I. And you look at Germany, they go to Germany, they trust the Germans, boom, Holocaust. So, but that is, again, a natural consequence, because if you're making things up and your stories can go in any direction, particularly if you're trying to engineer stories, right? I came to the United States with $40 in my pocket. I own a yogurt company. Don't look at all these Afghans we're bombing. Look at the Afghan who owns a yogurt company. It gets to the point where if you don't actually care about other people within that core basis, that all you're doing is teaching high-level principles of morality, it leaves the door open to massacring people that don't align with your own system, your own belief system. And that is unfortunately what typically happens within any Western Christian society. It's happened in Germany, and now it's happened in the United States. So that's why, in a nutshell, politics matters, because you get to guide the stories. It didn't work in the United States. You would think Obama would have helped guide the story in a better direction. Obama will most likely go down in history as basically the catalyst for America's Hitler, Donald Trump. That sounds romantic, but if you think about the flip, it's not as if half the country suddenly became better or worse in 4 or 5, 6 years. The stories didn't make sense to them. And the reason is because the entire system in the United States is based on making things up in order to differentiate themselves from the East. This is what teenagers do, right? They rebel against their parents. The difference is when teenagers get older, they usually start to appreciate the parents, and they try to learn more from the parents. Not the United States. The United States has become an ahistorical society. They perpetual teenagers, just destroying things around them, not caring about history. But that actually makes sense. If your history is horrible, if it's based on exploitation, if it's based on slavery, being the largest economy in the colonies for the most part, why wouldn't you be ahistorical? Why would you want to learn history? Why wouldn't you just make it up? And again, the problem with making things up is effectively, if you're not part of the majority storytelling, you get wiped out or you get expelled. This has happened, this is not new. James Baldwin, exiled to France, probably the smartest black man in the United States, from the United States. Tells the Paris Review, I left the United States with nothing but $40 in my pocket. Because if I had stayed, I would have killed myself or killed somebody else. Malcolm X, shot. Martin Luther King, 1 year to the day after doing an anti-Vietnam War speech, in which he says, the United States is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. Gets killed. You're not allowed in this country to have an opinion that's different, because if you do, it opens the door to realizing that everything you see around you is founded on immorality. And the thing with traveling is when you go out, you become very suspicious of the United States. Because when you travel, there are a lot more brown people, a lot more colored people everywhere. But over here, I've been walking around, every single person I've seen is white. All of them. So how does that happen? It doesn't happen by accident, because the joke, right, is whenever the Christians show up in the West, the joke is all the brown people become white. But when the Muslims show up, brown stays brown. So Northern Africa, not just brown, but all kinds of other colors, right? Saudi Arabia, tan skin. Brown stays brown. So that's the advantage of having a law-based system that does have an unbroken chain of custody. You can say everything about the Quran that the Americans want to believe about the Constitution of the United States. That it's really a holy document, that it's unchanged. You want to look at the original founder's intent, so on and so forth. That's all applicable to the Quran, not to the Bible. Or sorry, to the Constitution or the Bible. Interesting, right? So, in fact, the great thing about, we talked about Columbus and how it's a fake holiday. Right now, the majority of the justices on the United States Supreme Court are Catholic. They're either practicing Catholics. One of them is a former Catholic, I think. Well, he's an Anglican. married to a British woman, smartest guy in the court. And again, majority Catholic or went to a private Catholic high school. So remember, the founders of this country were overwhelmingly Protestant. They have all kinds of letters against the idea of a Catholic monarchy. The literal reason they created a republic is to prevent a monarchy, by which they meant the Catholic Church, which had expelled them from the UK. These are Englishmen who came here. They weren't Americans then. They were expelled, and they wanted to create a legal system, not so that all men could be free. They were enslaving people in the process of becoming free, right? George Carlin has a whole has a whole thing on this, including when I talked about bombing brown people. So that's George Carlin. So this isn't, I'm not saying anything new, but the idea again is that you have a Supreme Court today, and the people on that Supreme Court profess to believe in originalism, like we can divine what the original founders thought. But the first thing they would tell you is, no way in hell are we putting maybe we'll put one Catholic on the Supreme Court, maybe probably a Baptist actually. We're not going to put any Catholics on there. We just escaped from these people in Europe. What the hell is going on? The founders of this country would not recognize the Supreme Court. They would not recognize what has now become in a country that was designed to escape the persecution of the Catholic Church. The city of San Jose, which has had a Catholic mayor for the last 20 years that went to the same Catholic private high school, wouldn't recognize the governor of California, which for the last 20 years, probably more than that, has been Catholic. Wouldn't recognize, again, we just talked about the Supreme Court. We talked about the last president who was Catholic. We talked about the wife of the current president, Catholic, the vice president, Catholic. So when you have this situation coming in, you only get there if if your education system is effectively deficient. That's the only way you get to where we are today. So you may be tempted to blame, after what I just said, Catholics or whatever. That may be very tempting. But again, we talk about systems. Hi, how you doing? What matters again are not just systems, not just belief systems, but the people that are in charge of those systems. So one thing I've learned is that it doesn't matter what you call your system. Any system can work if the people behind it are smart and compassionate, and also are meticulous about results and willing to change their approach if the results don't match with their ideology. In a nutshell, I just said the reason for Singapore's success, the most successful political system possibly in all of modern history. Certainly one that I believe is the most successful in all of modern history. So, hopefully you've learned something. The key thing I hope you haven't learned is, well, I'm going to be anti this or anti that, or whatever. You have to learn that if you are in a Western Christian society, a lot of what you see around you is an IQ test. And so, it's designed to get you out of the formal structures and into the informal structures. And that's one of the reasons why criminals in this country are more interesting than politicians and everyone else. The bad guys in America are probably better than the good guys, because they figured out the whole country is based on a lie. And so, when I was in Las Vegas, one of the car dealers, an older woman, told me, this place was much better when the mafia was running it. I believe her 100%. 100%. And now, the problem is even the mafia isn't doing a good job. Donald Trump is failing for the most part, in part because the lawyers are stepping up and trying to assert themselves. But, again, the United States is built on a lie. The reason we're so fractured is because about half the country, maybe not half, well, maybe say 20% have figured out it's a lie and have sort of opted out. The other half, on whether, it doesn't matter what side you're on, they still believe the lies, basically. And that's a problem. So what do you do if you're in a country that is based on either immorality because of chattel slavery or lies? Well, look at Germany, right? Germany, you step off the train in Weimar, you pass by memories, physical memories, whether it's a hologram outpost or little gold plates that are on the sidewalk. Whether you look up or down, you're looking at a Holocaust survivor, because I think the Auschwitz camp is pretty much one train stop away. You can't help but know history up front in Germany. That's part of the solution, that you don't lie about your history. You say, we were evil people. Or not just we were evil people, but whether or not we were evil, we don't try to hedge it, right? You just say, whether you were directly involved or indirectly involved, these evils happened because of you. And so, we don't want to go marching, with drums on the street. We don't want to do these things. We want to create a society that's worth living in with the knowledge that our ancestors failed and it's up to us. Again, that's important. You're creating something new, right? You don't believe the stories of the past. Now you get an opportunity to create your own story, divorced from the past. Unfortunately, the Germans are also like law and order types, but whether or not that works in a Christian society, who knows? Maybe they've de facto replaced ideological laws with scientific laws, solar panels and energy consciousness and recycling and so on and so forth. Maybe that could work, but it's up to them to find out, up to the whole world to find out. It's in the process of happening. So when you talk about politics, what are we talking about? We're not talking about an American-style system that blames everyone else or tries to distract you in order to create, in order to maintain a real estate tax exemption or some other benefit. We're talking about a system that determines what you believe in. And in the United States, the system has been designed to rebel against all authority figures, and in doing so, create a more vibrant, creative society. The problem is that when real estate prices are $1 million, when a very small apartment is $1 million, that doesn't work. The whole system collapses, then you gotta blame somebody, right? That just didn't make it happen. And not for nothing, there are no successors to the United States, to Muhammad Ali. No successors to Malcolm X. Not even Martin Luther King. James Baldwin, nobody. The only African-American intellectual I can think of is a scientist, Neil deGrasse Tyson. And that's interesting because when I was growing up, all of my heroes, for the most part, were African-Americans, except for the scientists. Stephen Jay Gould, Michio, I can't pronounce his last name, but actually went to school nearby here. So, things have flipped. So are we in the Matrix? It flipped pretty decisively. So the question is, are we in the Matrix? Possibly. But again, the key for you is to figure out not who's lying to you, but whether your entire life has been a lie, whether all your teachers are lying to you, whether the entire system is lying to you in order to benefit somebody else. In this case, it's probably whoever has concentration of property, especially whoever has that property and doesn't want to pay taxes on it. That's going to squeeze out the creatives that made this country worth living in. John Lennon. There we go. Although he was British, not an American. Well, there we go. If we can't create another Malcolm X or a domestic John Lennon, what's the point, right? Well, hopefully we'll learn something, and somebody else will have an opportunity to step in and create something that is more interesting and more vibrant than what you see here, which is effectively an empty street in $1 million neighborhood. All right, guys. Take care.